1962. A blind 11-year-old walks into Motown and gets signed as Little Stevie Wonder. That same year, Elvis Presley sat on top of the world as the king of rock and roll. But was he really the king? Chuck D didn't think so. Neither did Ray Charles. The Memphis newspaper said someone else deserved it. So, who was right, and where did that leave a kid like Stevie, growing up right inside that argument? The boy from Saginaw, the king from Memphis, Detroit, 1961. A boy walks into a recording studio on West Grand Boulevard. He can't see the walls around him, can't see the microphones or the piano in the corner. He never has, but he can hear everything. And what he hears changes the trajectory of his entire life. His name was Stevland Hardaway Judkins. Not Stevie yet, not Wonder yet. Just an 11-year-old kid from Saginaw, Michigan, born 6 weeks too early, in a delivery that left him blind before he ever opened his eyes. Doctors called it retinopathy of prematurity. His mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, called it something else. A reason to push him harder, not softer. The family moved to Detroit when he was small. Money was tight. 6 kids under one roof, a single mother holding it together. But Detroit had something Saginaw didn't. It had Hitsville, USA, a modest house on West Grand Boulevard that Berry Gordy had turned into the beating heart of Motown Records just 2 years earlier. A converted photography studio with a hand-painted sign out front and a recording booth crammed into what used to be a garage. And it had Ronnie White, a member of the Miracles, who heard this kid singing and playing harmonica on the block and thought, this isn't ordinary. White brought him to Gordy. Gordy listened, and just like that, an 11-year-old blind kid from a working-class Detroit family had a record deal. No lawyers negotiating for weeks, no long audition process. Just a kid with a harmonica, a room full of Motown staff, and a decision made fast because the talent was obvious the second he opened his mouth. Producer Clarence Paul gave him the name that stuck. He'd joked that the kid played too many instruments to keep track of. Drums, piano, harmonica, all of it. Self-taught, all by ear. We can't keep calling him the 8th wonder of the world, Paul reportedly said. Little Stevie Wonder was born out of that line. Here's the part people forget. Being signed didn't mean being famous. His first album, released that same year, was called The Jazz Soul of Little Stevie. It barely made a dent. Motown didn't know what to do with him yet. Was he a jazz act? A novelty? A gospel-adjacent prodigy they could market to churches? Nobody had a clear answer. He was a mystery in some rooms and a curiosity in others. Blind, 11 years old. Doing runs on a harmonica that grown musicians on the same label couldn't keep up with. For a while, that uncertainty nearly buried him. Motown was still finding its footing itself back then, still building the sound that would define the decade. A young blind kid who didn't fit neatly into any category was a hard sell to radio programmers looking for something they already understood. Then came the following year, and everything changed in about 3 minutes of tape. A live recording, cut almost by accident, called Fingertips Part 2. It captured Stevie mid-performance, calling out to the band, refusing to let the song end when it was supposed to. You can hear him yell, "Everybody say yeah," like he's daring the room to keep up with him. That wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. The band actually loses him for a second, scrambling to follow where he's taking the song. That chaos on tape became the whole appeal. It shot straight to #1. He was 13 years old, the youngest artist in history at that point, to top the Billboard Hot 100. A blind kid from Saginaw had just done something no one his age had ever done before, on a record that wasn't even supposed to be the single. Now, picture the other side of the country that same year. Elvis Presley isn't a rising star anymore. He's already the story. Army service behind him, 2 years spent stationed in Germany, drafted right at the peak of his fame. A string of movies in front of him now. Blue Hawaii, fresh in theaters, pulling in audiences who wanted the clean-cut, post-Army version of him. Radio stations across America are playing him constantly. Magazines already call him one thing, and one thing only, the king of rock and roll. That title wasn't voted on. Nobody held an election. A handful of writers, DJs, and record executives just started saying it. Somewhere back in the mid-50s, and it stuck so hard that by the early 60s, it barely needed explaining anymore. Say, the king in America, and everyone knew exactly who you meant. By the time Stevie Wonder had his first #1, Elvis had already worn that crown for the better part of a decade. He'd done it through a hit television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, through a run of #1 singles, through movie after movie that turned him into as much a Hollywood name as a musical one. Two very different worlds. One kid clawing his way onto the charts from a Motown side street, singing into a microphone in a converted garage. One man who'd already been declared royalty by an entire industry, backed by a major studio machine and years of momentum. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and where most retellings stop too soon. Motown wasn't just a record label, it was a message. Gordy built it to prove black artists could dominate American music on their own terms, without asking permission from anyone, without needing a white-owned studio system to make them palatable to mainstream audiences. Stevie Wonder was walking proof of that. A prodigy who didn't need Elvis's version of rock and roll to succeed. He had his own sound, his own label, his own path. And yet the two of them existed on the same radio dial, at the same record stores, in the same country still working through segregation. The same country where Motown's touring acts, on package tours through the South, still had to plan their routes around which towns would let them sleep in a hotel and which ones wouldn't. Elvis got a crown, movie deals, and Army headlines. Stevie got a chance to prove himself, one hit at a time, on a label built specifically because chances like that weren't handed out equally to begin with. That difference didn't go unnoticed, not by fans, not by critics, and not by the artists who came up in the exact same years as Elvis, playing the exact same music, drawing from the exact same wells of blues and gospel, but never once getting called a king. Some of them stayed quiet about it for years, others didn't stay quiet at all. The kings who never got crowned. The real documented backlash, 1989. A film called Do the Right Thing hits theaters. Spike Lee's camera opens on a boombox blasting a song that doesn't ask for permission. The song is Fight the Power by Public Enemy. And buried inside it is a line that would follow its writer for decades. Chuck D didn't hide what he meant. Elvis, he said later, wasn't the hero everybody made him out to be. He'd earned that crown, king of rock and roll, while the men who actually built the sound got nothing close to it. Chuck D pointed to names most casual fans never learned. Little Richard, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry. So, who's anointing him king? He asked. That line landed like a grenade. It wasn't a subtle jab buried in a verse nobody noticed. It played over the opening credits of one of the most talked about films of the decade, blasting out of Radio Raheem's boombox before a single line of dialogue even started. Millions of people heard that question before they knew anything else about the movie. That question didn't come out of nowhere, though. It had been sitting under the surface of American music for over 3 decades, waiting for someone loud enough to ask it on a stage that big. Go back to 1956. Elvis is exploding. Hound Dog is everywhere. Except Hound Dog wasn't his. Big Mama Thornton recorded it 3 years earlier. Her version sold close to 2 million copies inside the rhythm and blues world. Deep growl, slow blues. A song written specifically for her voice and nobody else's. She never crossed over. She couldn't. The radio stations that would have made her a household name weren't playing black artists to white audiences, no matter how big the record sold within its own lane. Elvis walked through the door she couldn't reach, sang her song, sped it up, added his own snarl to it, and became a phenomenon almost overnight. Same lyrics, same structure, a completely different outcome, because he happened to be the one holding the microphone the industry was willing to broadcast. Thornton kept working for decades after that. She toured, she recorded, she influenced a generation of blues and rock musicians who came after her. But she never got close to Elvis's level of fame off that song. By most accounts, she made only a few $100s total from the original recording, while Elvis's version became one of the defining hits of his career. That gap wasn't an accident. It wasn't just talent or timing. It was a music industry and a country, still operating under rules that decided whose voice got amplified and whose didn't. Chuck D wasn't inventing a grievance out of nothing when he wrote that line in 1989. He was naming something that had been true since the moment Hound Dog first crossed from one chart to another, carrying a different name attached to it. That pattern repeated itself again and again through the 50s. White radio wouldn't touch the originals. White radio embraced the covers. and the men who wrote and performed rock and roll first watched somebody else get crowned for it. Ray Charles never let it go quietly. Years later, in an interview that still circulates today, he laid it out in plain language. Black people had been shaking their behinds for centuries, he said. Elvis didn't invent that. He copied it, dressed it up, and got called a revolutionary for it. Charles didn't buy the title. He believed the real founders of the sound were Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Chuck Berry, three black musicians who never got the word king attached to their names. The Chicago Defender agreed. When Elvis died in 1977, the paper ran a piece that didn't mince words. It named Chuck Berry the actual king of rock and roll and said Elvis was closer to a prince, wearing a crown that belonged to somebody else. Had Berry been born white, the paper argued, he'd have worn that crown and worn it well. So that's one side of it, a pretty damning one. But here's where the story stops being simple. Not every black artist from that era saw it the same way. Little Richard, one of the very men Ray Charles pointed to as the true pioneer, said something almost opposite. In 1970, he told an interviewer he thanked God for Elvis Presley. Elvis, he said, opened the door that let him walk through. Richard understood better than almost anyone what it cost to be a black rock and roll artist trying to reach a white audience in the 50s. And he still credited Elvis with cracking that door open, even if Elvis walked through it easier than Richard ever could. James Brown felt similarly. He and Elvis crossed paths for years, and Brown didn't describe him as a thief. He called him a brother, not a rival, not competition, family. B.B. King took a more measured stance. He didn't see theft in what Elvis did. He saw reinterpretation. King grew up around the same Memphis scene Elvis came out of, the same Beale Street clubs, the same gospel churches. In his eyes, Elvis wasn't stealing a culture he had no connection to. He was raised inside it, shaped by it, and he never denied that influence publicly. And that's true. Elvis didn't hide where his sound came from. In a 1957 interview with Jet magazine, he told a black reporter plainly that rock and roll existed long before he showed up, and that nobody could sing it the way black artists could. He named Fats Domino specifically. He talked about sneaking into black churches as a kid to hear the music that would define his entire career. So, which version is true? The one where Elvis is an unrepentant thief, or the one where he's a grateful student who got lucky? Maybe the honest answer is both. The music historians who've studied this longest keep landing in the same place. Elvis didn't invent the sound, but he also didn't sneak up and steal it in the dark. He grew up next to it, loved it openly, and then got rewarded for it in ways the originators never could be, because of a system built to reward exactly that. That system is the real story here, not one man's guilt or innocence. A country where a white performer singing black music could headline arenas, and the black originators of that same music were still fighting for basic radio play. By the time Stevie Wonder was topping the charts as a teenager, this entire argument was already alive around him. He wasn't a bystander to it. He was building his career inside the same industry that had crowned Elvis years earlier, on a label that existed specifically to prove black artists didn't need white validation to succeed. Which raises an obvious question. With all these voices weighing in, some furious, some forgiving, where did Stevie Wonder actually stand? That's where the story gets complicated, because unlike Chuck D, unlike Ray Charles, unlike Little Richard, Stevie never stepped into this fight publicly. No angry lyrics, no headline-grabbing interview, just silence stretched out across a career that spanned 6 decades. And in the age of the internet, silence doesn't stay empty for long. Somebody always fills it in. The silence around Stevie. Address directly, search his name next to Elvis Presley online, and something strange happens. Headlines pop up. Stevie Wonder's honest thoughts on Elvis revealed. Rare statement. Bold claims, dramatic titles, thumbnails with his face next to Elvis's, looking almost like a showdown. Click on most of them, and there's nothing there. No interview, no quote, no source. Just a title built to get a click, sitting on top of an empty page. That's worth pausing on, because it tells you something important before we go any further. There is no verified record of Stevie Wonder giving his honest opinion on Elvis Presley, not in a documentary, not in a magazine profile, not in one of his hundreds of interviews across 60 years of public life. If it exists, it hasn't surfaced anywhere credible. So, Why does the internet keep insisting otherwise? Part of it is simple. Stevie Wonder is one of the most respected musicians alive. His opinion would carry weight. People want to know what he thinks, especially about a subject as loaded as this one. When the real answer doesn't exist, somebody manufactures it instead. A blog post here, a vague Facebook page there. Enough repetition, and a fabricated opinion starts sounding like fact. That's not unique to Stevie. It happens to musicians, actors, athletes, anyone with enough fame to make a fake quote spread fast. But it does something specific here. It papers over what might be the more interesting answer. Not what Stevie said, what he never said, and why that might matter more. Think about the position he was actually in. Signed to Motown at 11, a chart-topping artist by 13. A teenager watching Elvis dominate radio, television, and film, all while working inside a label built specifically to prove black artists didn't need that kind of system to succeed. If anyone had a reason to weigh in, it was him. He didn't. Not during the 60s when the fingertips success was still fresh. Not during the 70s when he released Talking Book, Inner Visions, and Songs in the Key of Life. 3 albums that reshaped what popular music could sound like and turned him from a prodigy into one of the most respected songwriters of his generation. Not during the 80s, when he led the public campaign to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday, a fight he won in 1983. Not once across any of it did he publicly weigh in on Elvis Presley's legacy. That's a long silence to hold, especially for a man who never stayed quiet about things that mattered to him. Because Stevie Wonder wasn't shy about speaking up. He spoke up on civil rights. He spoke up on apartheid, campaigning hard for sanctions against South Africa in the 80s. He spoke up on gun violence, on poverty, on accessibility for people with disabilities. This is not a man who avoided difficult subjects out of fear. So the silence on Elvis looks less like avoidance and more like a choice, a specific one. Maybe it's this. Stevie Wonder's entire career was never built around comparing himself to anyone. Listen to his interviews across the decades, and a theme keeps surfacing. Music to him wasn't a competition for a crown. It was a tool, a way to move people, to heal something, to say what needed to be said when words alone weren't enough. That's the philosophy running under songs like Higher Ground and Living for the City. Not who's the king. What can the music actually do? Maybe weighing in on Elvis never fit into that worldview. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the question itself, who deserves the crown, wasn't one he considered worth answering. There's another possibility too, less flattering to the internet's appetite for drama. Maybe he just never got asked the right way, by the right person at the right time, and it simply never came up. 60 years is a long career. Not every question gets addressed in every interview. Silence doesn't always mean something profound. Sometimes it just means nobody pressed hard enough on that particular subject. Either way, here's the honest answer, the one without a dramatic headline attached to it. Stevie Wonder has not gone on record with an opinion on Elvis Presley's legacy, positive or negative. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling you a headline, not a fact. What we do know is where he came from, and what he built while Elvis was already being called a king, a blind kid from Saginaw, who didn't need anyone's crown to change the sound of American music forever. 25 Grammy Awards, songs still played at weddings, funerals, protests, and everything in between. A legacy that doesn't depend on winning an argument that other artists were having without him. Maybe that's the real answer to a question that never got asked directly, not silence out of fear. Silence because he was too busy building something that would outlast the debate entirely. And that debate, the one Chuck D reignited, the one Ray Charles never let go of, hasn't stayed in the past either. It keeps coming back. New generations keep discovering it, keep asking the same question in new ways, which means the story isn't finished yet. Why This Argument Refuses to Die, 2018. A documentary called The King hits film festivals. The concept is strange on paper. A crew buys one of Elvis Presley's old Rolls Royces, drives it across America, and lets people climb inside and talk. Musicians, politicians, everyday strangers. The car becomes a confession booth on wheels. Chuck D climbs in, so does CNN commentator Van Jones. Both bring up the same old wound. Elvis got the crown. The originators didn't. Decades after Fight the Power, Chuck D is still saying the same thing, just calmer this time, sitting in the back of the very car that made Elvis rich. That's the first clue that this story never actually ended. It just kept finding new rooms to walk into. 4 years later, it happened again. Baz Luhrmann released Elvis, a big loud biopic with Austin Butler in the lead role. And this time, the film did not dodge the question. It leaned straight into it. Early scenes put young Elvis inside black churches on Beale Street, soaking up gospel music before he ever picked up a guitar professionally. Shanka Dukura appears as Big Mama Thornton, performing Hound Dog, the way it sounded before Elvis ever touched it. Butler, promoting the film, said something that would have been unthinkable in earlier Elvis movies. "We don't have Elvis without black music and black culture. No hedging, no vague gesture at influences. A flat statement put right into the marketing for a major studio release." That's a shift worth sitting with. For decades, Elvis films avoided this conversation almost entirely, adoring biopics, glossy concert footage, very little context about where the sound actually came from. Luhrmann's version did the opposite. It put the tension front and center, and audiences went anyway. The film made close to $300 million worldwide. So the argument didn't fade with time. If anything, it got more visible. More films, more documentaries, more articles revisiting it every few years, each one finding a new audience that's never heard the debate before. Why does it keep resurfacing instead of settling? Part of the answer is simple math. Every year, new listeners discover Elvis for the first time. Every year, new listeners discover Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Big Mama Thornton for the first time too. And the moment someone learns both stories side by side, the same question hits them fresh. How did one become a king and the others didn't? That question doesn't come with a clean answer. And unresolved questions are exactly the kind that keep getting reopened. There's a bigger reason too, one that has nothing to do with Elvis specifically. The pattern didn't stop in the 50s. It kept happening. White artists finding massive commercial success, performing sounds that black musicians built first, often with far less credit, far less money, and far less lasting recognition. Elvis just happens to be the biggest, most famous example. Talking about him becomes a way of talking about all of it at once. That's why the conversation refuses to sit still in the past. It's not really about one man from Tupelo, Mississippi anymore. It's about a pattern that people still see playing out today, in different genres, different decades, different names. Now, bring Stevie Wonder back into this picture. He never joined the argument publicly. We covered that already. But his career did something almost more interesting than picking a side. It became proof that a different path existed entirely. Look at what happened after those early Motown hits. Stevie didn't fade out as a novelty act, the way a lot of child stars from that era did. He kept building. By his early 20s, he pushed Motown for full creative control over his own music, an almost unheard of demand at the time for an artist that young. He got it. What followed was a run of albums that most musicians spend a lifetime chasing and never reach. Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness First Finale, Songs in the Key of Life. 4 albums back to back that critics still call some of the greatest records ever made in any genre. He didn't need Elvis's version of stardom to get there. He built his own version on his own terms, inside a system that was never designed to make that easy for him. That matters here, because the who's the real king argument assumes there's one throne, one crown, one winner. Stevie Wonder's career quietly argues against that whole premise. 25 Grammy Awards, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989, a Kennedy Center honoree, songs still played at graduations, weddings, and protest marches, decades after they were recorded. None of that required unseating Elvis. It just happened independently, on a completely different track. Maybe that's the quiet rebuttal underneath all of this. Not an angry lyric like Chuck D's, not a blunt interview quote like Ray Charles gave. Just decades of undeniable work, existing as its own answer. Still, the mystery from the last section lingers. If Stevie's success speaks for itself, why do people keep inventing quotes for him anyway? Why manufacture an opinion he never gave? Because audiences want closure. They want a definitive answer to a messy historical question, and they want it from a voice they trust. Stevie Wonder carries exactly that kind of trust. Decades of music, decades of activism, a reputation for honesty that very few public figures maintain for that long. If Stevie Wonder said Elvis stole rock and roll, or if Stevie Wonder said Elvis deserved his crown, either version would feel like it settled something. That's exactly why it's so tempting to invent. But real history rarely settles that cleanly. The truth sits somewhere messier. Elvis grew up genuinely inside black musical culture in Memphis, sneaking into churches, listening to gospel and blues before he ever had a career to protect. He said as much himself, on the record, back in 1957. And at the exact same time, the system around him rewarded his version of that music in ways it never rewarded the originators. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other out. That's an uncomfortable answer. It doesn't fit neatly into a headline. It doesn't give you a clean villain or a clean hero. Maybe that's exactly why the fabricated quotes keep circulating. A clean, decisive Stevie Wonder opinion is more satisfying than the real, complicated history sitting underneath it. Here's what actually deserves the spotlight instead. A blind 11-year-old from Saginaw signed the same era Elvis Presley was already being called a king, who spent the next 6 decades proving that greatness doesn't require anyone's crown to be real. He didn't need to settle the Elvis debate. He was too busy writing Isn't She Lovely? Too busy writing Superstition, too busy accepting his 5th, 10th, 20th Grammy, while other artists were still arguing about who deserved a title from 1956. The argument about Elvis will probably never fully die. New films will reopen it, new documentaries will interview new voices. Every generation seems to need its own version of that conversation on the record. But Stevie Wonder's answer, if you can call it that, was never going to come as a quote in an interview. It came as a body of work too large to argue with. And maybe that's a more honest kind of statement than any headline could ever manufacture for him. So that's the real story, not a manufactured quote, not a fake headline. Just two artists who came up in the same era, took completely different paths, and left behind a debate that still hasn't found its ending. Elvis got the crown, Stevie Wonder built something that never needed one. What do you think? Was Elvis really the king, or did that title belong to someone else